This video is sponsored by Eduonix, who has two programs coming out. One is an AWS preparation course to help developers achieve AWS certifications and handle real-world use cases. It includes practical labs, practice tests, and more. The other is a data science foundational program with 4 courses on data science, including Python and R programming. It also includes 4 ebooks and 3 bonus prep guides. To check these programs out, check the Kickstarter links in the description below. Hey, what's up guys? So a little while ago I asked for some suggestions on video topics, and I got a lot of requests for GraphQL as well as the Apollo client and React. So in this series we're going to use all of those things, and I'm also thinking about creating a Udemy course on these technologies. Now, if you don't know what GraphQL is, it's a way to query your data. It's somewhat similar to REST, and you can use it with existing REST APIs, as we're going to do here. But instead of getting all or nothing like you do when you make a request to a REST API, you can ask for specific things. So if I want to just, let's say, ask for just the title from some sort of reference like a blog post, I can ask for that. Unlike REST, where I would have to get everything from that reference data and then parse it and pull out just the title. So it saves you on requests and stuff like that. Now, GraphQL can make apps faster because the app controls the data that you get basically over the server, and the queries are also very elegant and almost look like JavaScript objects, as you can see right here. This is the actual official GraphQL website, and this is basically how you can query data. So I also have a 5-part series on creating a GraphQL server with Express, so just the back end, just the server part. I'll put that link in the description. It will give you more insight on things like mutations to update data and so on. The app that we'll be building is basically just going to use queries, which is just fetching data rather than updating or creating stuff like that. So it's basically a read-only app. But what I want to focus on this series is not just building a GraphQL server like my other series, but I want to build a front end with React and something called Apollo. Actually, it's Apollo 2.1 that we'll be using, and it's a client to interface with our GraphQL server. Okay, so I think one of the most difficult things these days is that we have so many different technologies, it's sometimes hard to understand how do we put them all together and make them all work together. So that's my main goal with this series. So what we'll be building is this app right here. And what this is going to do is we're going to interface with the Spacex Api, which gives you a whole bunch of data, launches, rockets, all types of stuff. You could extend this app to include much more data. But what it does is it lists the missions that have went on since the beginning of 2006. And as you can see, some are red, some are green. Most are green after the first few. There's one red here. These are the ones that failed, the ones in red. So we're going to create a little key component here just to let the user know that. We're going to use Bootstrap, but we're using a custom theme from Bootswatch. And we're using React Router so that we can go to the launch details page, which gives us some other details, gives us the details of the rocket that was used, the ID, the name, the type of rocket. And again, you can get more data than this, but I just wanted to show you how everything works, but it's up to you if you want to extend the application, and I would suggest doing that. Tutorials can only take you so far. So yeah, that's what we'll be building. It's pretty simple as far as functionality, but there's a lot that goes into it. We might even do the deployment. You can see I actually have it on Heroku now, so there's a couple extra steps to deploy. And as far as data, we're using third-party data from Spacex, but of course you could use MongoDB database or MySQL or any kind of SQL database, anything like that. When you use GraphQL, you're not limited to a certain way to store your data. You can use anything, and you can use GraphQL with other languages and other frameworks, and it's not specifically for JavaScript, for React, or anything like that. So yeah, so let's get started, and we'll jump into VS Code. All right, guys, so we're in VS Code now, and I just have an empty folder called Spacex Launch Stats. That's the name of the application. And I, as you guys know, if you watch my videos, I like to start from absolute scratch. That's why I didn't want to just build the server and then just say, oh, we're just going to do the React Apollo part. I want you guys to know how to do things from start to finish. And because I get aggravated when I watch tutorials and they just, start in the middle. So let's go ahead and start from scratch. We're going to go ahead and do an npm init. I guess I'll answer these questions here. So launch stats, that's the name of the app. Version is good. Description, we'll just say app that lists SpaceX launches or launch missions. And entry point, I'm actually going to make server.js. And go through that. We don't need that. Author. If you guys want to put your own name, that's fine. This is completely open source. Okay. So now we have our package.json file. Let's go ahead and install the dependencies that we're going to need. So we're going to say npm install, or yarn if you want to use yarn. And we want GraphQL itself. And then we're using Express, so we need to install something called Express-GraphQL, which allows them to basically integrate together. Of course, we need Express, and we're going to need Axios to make requests to the Spacex API, or you could use Fetch if you want, but I like to use Axios. And let's see, I think that's all we'll do for now. There are some other ones, but we'll get to those later. So these are the things we need now. All right, so those are installed. I also want to install NodeMon so that we don't have to keep restarting our server when we make changes, but I do want to install it as a dev dependency, so we want to do -D NodeMon. Okay, so that way, it just continuously watches every time we save, it'll update the server. All right, so now let's add some scripts so that we can run our server once we add our code. So we're going to have start, which is simply going to run the file with node. So we're going to say node server.js, and then to run NodeMon, I'm going to do server so that we can do npm run server. Because remember, we're going to have a server part and then a client part, which will be React and Apollo. So to run just the back end, we want to run NodeMon. Let's say NodeMon server.js. All right, that should be it for now. So let's go ahead and save that, and we can close this file up for now. So now let's create our server.js file. And we're going to start off by bringing in what we need. So we need Express. So we want to require Express, and we want to bring in a couple other things. Let's bring in Express GraphQL. I actually don't have to delete that. Let's say GraphQL, and we want to bring this in as GraphQL HTTP. Okay, now I just want to show you the GraphQL GitHub real quick, or the Express GraphQL GitHub, just so you can see what we're doing here. All right, so as you can see, it's brought in as GraphQL HTTP. And the idea here is, if you've ever worked with Express, which I'm sure a lot of you have, you usually create different routes, right? So you'll have routes to, I don't know, show blog posts, or to a post route to update blog posts. With GraphQL and Express, we only have one endpoint, and that's going to be /GraphQL. From there, we create a schema, okay? So we'll have a schema file that's going to include basically all the queries that we want, any mutations if we want to like add things or update things on the server, to update data, stuff like that. So this is the only endpoint that we need. So what I'm going to do here is just copy this. Actually, I'll just grab all this. And we'll get rid of this for now. We do have some other stuff that we'll bring in later, but we don't need it yet. So we're just initializing Express as usual. And like I said, we have one endpoint of /GraphQL that's going to run GraphQL HTTP, which is the Express GraphQL. We're going to point to our schema, which I'm actually just going to call schema. So we can just do this. And then graphical is the tool that I was saying that we can use as our client to make queries to our server, and it's really, really cool. If you guys have never used it, you'll see it's a very handy tool. So let's see, down here we want to listen on a certain port. I'm going to create a variable called port, and I'm going to set this to process.env.port. So we'll set it to the environment variable. So when we deploy to Heroku, if we do, it'll read that, or port 5000 in development. Okay, so we're going to be listening on 5000. So in our app.listen, let's put in our port variable, and then I'm just going to put an arrow function just to console.log. Oops. Let's console log, put some backticks, and we'll say server started on port, and we'll use our variable syntax, and we'll say port. Okay, so yeah, that looks good. Let's save that. Now, the schema, obviously, we need to create. If I try to run this, let's say npm run server. Let's see what it says here. Yeah, so it's just telling us that schema is not defined. So up here, let's say const schema, and we want to set this to require a file. So // it's going to be in the same directory, called schema or schema.js. So we have to create that file. So schema.js, and this is basically where all of our GraphQL stuff is going to go. So there's a lot of different types that you can use with GraphQL. For instance, there's the GraphQL object type, which is like our launches will be an object type. Our rockets will be an object type. If you were creating a blog, your users, your posts, these would all be GraphQL object types. So let's bring that in. We're going to say GraphQL. Actually, if we do this, actually, never mind, I don't have that extension installed. So we'll just say const GraphQL object type, and we want to bring that in. From the actual GraphQL module. Okay. Now, let's see. I'm just trying to think of the best way to explain this. So we're going to have basically two types, or two object types, two resources. That's going to be launches and rockets. So let's create our launch type. So we want to just create a variable. I'm going to call it launch type, and we'll set this to new GraphQL object type. Okay. Now inside here, we put in an object that's going to have some key value pairs. So we want a name, which is going to be launch. Okay, that's going to be the name of our type, and then the fields. Okay, now fields, we're actually going to put an arrow function here, and we're going to go like that. All right, now each field that we have is going to also have a type. Okay, and it could be a string, integer, it could be another object type, it could be a lot of different things. Now, I think now is a good time to look at the Spacex API. So we want to go to the GitHub page here. Let's see. So Spacex REST API. So this is like, these are the endpoints. This is to get the latest launch. This will only give you one object, which is the latest one, which is flight number 69. You can see all the data that they give you, like all types of stuff. So if you wanted to make this a really extensive application, you could. I'm just kind of giving you the building blocks. I actually want to go, let's see, I think I want to go to the main site. Yeah, the docs. And over here, you can see that we're dealing with launches. So this gives us like all the fields, and it gives us the endpoints and all that. There's other stuff like payloads, and we're going to deal with rockets, but like Roadster. There's just all types of data from SpaceX that you can deal with. Capsules, cores. So you could build a pretty extensive application. Of course, it would probably be read-only, but a lot of data. A lot of available data. So we want to make a GET request to this endpoint. That's going to be our data. So I want to put, and here's a sample response over here. I'm just going to click on this, and shows us all the stuff that's available. Now, I only want a small portion of this data. So I want the flight number. That's going to kind of be our main field, like the ID. And then we want the mission name. We want what do we want? The launch year. I want the launch date. I want the rocket. So right here from the rocket, I want some fields from here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make rocket a separate object type. Okay, so we'll have launch type and rocket type. I also want the success value, which is, where is it? Right here, launch success. So those are really the only fields I'm going to be using, but of course you could take out any of this stuff and use it in your application. So as far as fields, let's do flight number. Okay. So flight number, and we need to actually give this a type. So we want to say type, and this is going to be an int. Okay, so an integer, which is basically a number. So I want to bring that in from GraphQL as well as the object type. So we want to wrap this in curly braces, and let's put a comma here, and let's bring in and you'll see we'll get in VS Code we'll now get a pop-up that has all the options. We want the int option. Okay, so for the type we want to say GraphQL int, and I'm just gonna go ahead and copy this down a few times. So we're gonna do 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So in addition to the flight number, I want to get the mission name. Now mission name is going to be a string, so we want to bring in GraphQL string, which is right here. We want to bring that in, and we're going to change this from int to string. Okay, the next thing that I want is the launch year. Launch year is actually going to be a string as well, and we want the launch date local. And this is also going to be a string. And we want the success, launch success. Okay, and this is actually going to be a Boolean, so we have to bring that in. Okay, any type we want to use, we have to just bring in up here. So let's say GraphQL Boolean. I'm going to save it. I have Prettier installed, so it's going to just format it like this, make it more readable. And let's change success to a Boolean. Okay, and then the last thing I want is the rocket. Okay, so we'll say rocket, except rocket is not going to be any type that we bring in like a string or a Boolean. It's going to be another object type. So it's actually going to be called rocket type. So let's say rocket type, which we haven't actually created yet. Okay, so let's go down here, and this is how you create relationships within your schema. So let's say rocket type, and we basically want to do the same thing we did here. I'll just copy this, and then we'll change this to rocket type. Okay, so it's going to be an object type, and the name is going to be rocket. And then as far as fields, we only have 3 fields. So let's get rid of those. And let's see. So first one is going to be the ID, rocket underscore ID, which will be, it's actually a string, because if we look at, let's see, rocket, see the ID, see how it's a string? It has quotes. The flight number is an int by default, so that's what I wanted to use there. So let's go back and set that to a string. And what else do we have? We have the rocket name, which is going to be a string. And then we want the rocket type, which will also be a string. So those are our basic object types that we want. Now you could take this further, and you could do like whatever's available with the data. like second stage and this stuff. I don't even know what that means. Ships. Like, there's all types of data. And obviously, if you were working with your own database, like MongoDB or something like that, you would structure it around that data. Okay, we're using a third-party API in this case, so of course we need to kind of match the fields that the API gives us. So now that we have our types, we need to create something called a root query. Okay, and in this root query, we can create basically kind of like endpoints that have resolvers that will resolve our data. So let's say root query, and the way that we do this is create a variable called root query, and let's set this to it's going to be an object type, so new GraphQL object type, just like the fields above. It's going to have a name, and we're going to call this root query type. All right, now the fields is going to be an object, and the first one I want is launches. Okay, so launches, I want this to basically get a list or an array of all of the launches. Okay, so this is going to be what's called a GraphQL list. So we actually have to bring that in. So you can see there's a lot of different things that we need to bring in here. So GraphQL list. So we want to do launches, give it a type. Okay, now the type is going to be a new GraphQL list. And we need to give this list a type, which is going to be a launch type. Okay, now next field is going to be what's called a resolver. So we want to say resolve, and this is actually a function, and we want to pass in two things, parent and args. Okay, now inside here is where we actually get our data, and it could be it could be different depending on what your data structure is or where it's stored. Like I said, ours is a third-party API, so we need to make a request to get that data. So we're going to use Axios. Did I install it already? I forget. Yes, I did. Okay. So I'm going to use Axios, but you could use something else if you wanted to use like Fetch or, I don't know, any of the other ones, Super Agent, something like that. I tend to use Axios for all my stuff, for all my requests. So let's bring that in. Let's say Axios require. All right, so bring that in, and then we want to go down here, and we just want to return our data. So what we're going to do is say return Axios.get, and we want to put in the Spacex endpoint, which is, let's go back here. Which is, I believe it's just this without the latest. Yeah, so we want this just /launches. So let's grab that and put that right in there. Okay, now this will give us a promise back, so we're going to do .then. You can use a sync await if you want. I'm not going to bother though. So res, and let's say res.data. Okay, so that's going to give us back all the data, and that's what we're resolving from this launches. Okay, we're going to get a list. So we can actually now test this. Okay, well, there's one more thing we have to do, and that's export. So we have to say module.exports, and here we want to export the GraphQL schema, which we also have to bring in. Okay, so we want to bring in GraphQL schema, and we'll say module exports new GraphQL schema. Okay, and then what this takes in is an object, and it's going to take your query, which is going to be our root query. Okay, it would also take in any mutations if we had any mutations. And again, I have that 5-part series on creating a GraphQL server, and we do basically a CRUD server with mutations. So if you're interested in that, I would recommend that series. So that should be it. Let's save this and let's go down here. Looks like we have no errors. So now our server is running. I'm going to go into our browser and I'm going to go to localhost and the port that we created this on, which is 5000, and then we want to go /GraphQL. So this is the graphical tool that I was talking about, and you can disable this if you go to where we created our GraphQL endpoint. You can set this to false if you want. Okay, if you want to disable this, and you might want to do that in production. So let's actually try to make a query now, because remember, we have the launches. We should be able to get all the launches. So I'm going to get rid of all these comments here. And the way that we write our queries is I think, very easy and elegant. So we just want to open up some curly braces. Excuse me. I'm going to actually just type in an L, and it will already look and see that we have a launches type, or a launches query. So I'm going to go ahead and select that, and then we want to open up another set of curly braces. Let me make this bigger. I want to open up another set of curly braces, and here's where we want to request basically the properties or the data that we want. And that's what's great about GraphQL, is I can get anything I want, and I don't have to get it's not all or nothing like with REST. So as you can see, I typed in flight, and flight number pops up because that's one of our fields. So if I wanted to get just the flight number, I'll go ahead and press play. And as you can see, it gives us this data object with this launches list with all of the flight numbers. Okay, so if I want to get the mission name, I'll go ahead, whoops, I didn't mean to save. I want to press play, and I'm going to get just the flight number and the mission name, so I can pick and choose what I want. So if I want everything, I can do that. I can put launch year, launch success, launch data local, or date local. So if I go ahead and do that, it'll give me that stuff. If I want the rocket, so say rocket, and remember, in our schema, rocket is of another object type of rocket type that has its own fields, such as rocket ID, rocket name, and rocket type. And of course, I could just pick and choose which of these that I wanted to fetch. So I'll go ahead and run that, and there we go. We get our rocket object with all of the data for each rocket. So you can see how cool this is, that you can just request certain fields. You know, when you make a GET request with REST to whatever data you're querying, you have to get all of it, and then you have to deal with, pick and choose what you want to use from it. So let's go back to VS Code now that we know that we can get all of the launches, and let's go ahead and add to our root query a launch field so that we can get a specific launch instead of a list of all of them. Okay, so let's see, under launches, which ends right here, we're going to put a comma, and we'll just simply say launch. Okay, and for launch, I want to add a type. Okay, so type. Now, this is just going to be a single launch, so we don't have to use GraphQL list. We can simply just say launch type. Okay, since it's a single one. And then it's going to need to know which launch to get. Okay, so it needs a parameter or an argument, and that's what this args is right here. So for args, we want to put in here what we basically want to use as the argument to find the launch, and we want to use flight number. That's basically our ID. In a lot of cases, this will be your ID, but we actually are using flight number. So we need to put flight number. We also need to give it a type here, and the type is going to be GraphQL int. Okay, then we want to write our resolve. Okay, so we'll say resolve, and let's say parent args. And here is where we want to make our request to get that single launch. Now, if we look at the Spacex API, I want to go back to the docs and look in the launches. So that's what we just made a request to get the list of launches. Now, if we go down here, let's get one launch. This is what we want. We need to put in the flight number, right? So let's copy this. Let's go back here and do the same thing. We're going to return axios.get, and let's paste that in. Now, instead of this here, you know what? Let's use backticks so that we can use a template literal here. We can use a variable, so we can put a variable in like that. And excuse me, we can get the flight number from args.flight number, and that will give us the flight number. Okay, so let's tack on a dot then, and we just want to resolve the data. So res.data. Oops, no parentheses there. And that should do it. Excuse me, I'm losing my voice. So this should be able to get us a single launch by the flight number. So let's head over back to graphical, and I'm going to just wipe this. Actually, I'll just reload here. Okay, now let's get rid of all these comments. Now to do this, same thing, we want curly braces here. Go to the top. And we want to say launch, okay? And you notice that both came up, launch and launches. But we want launch, and in order to get the specific launch, we need the flight number, so that's going to go in here. So we want to say flight number, and let's say we want the one with flight number 2, okay? They start at 1, they go up to, I think, 69. And then we'll put our curly braces, and again, we can specify what we want. So let's say we want the mission name, and I'll press play here, and we get demosat. Okay, so that's flight number 2's mission name. If I want to get the launch year, I could get anything I want here. Launch year, launch success. If we go ahead and run that, and since this is a launch, we also have the rocket type, right? So we can say rocket, and let's say we want the rocket name, and play, and there we go. We get Falcon 1. All right, so hopefully this makes sense, guys. What I want to do now is I want to create a couple other queries in our root query for rocket and rockets. We're not actually going to use this in our React Apollo application, but I want us to be able to query rockets if we want. So let's head back, and to get the rockets and the single rocket, we can just copy these two, launches and launch, because it's very similar. So we'll copy those and then just put a comma here and paste it in, and then we'll change this to rockets, and then it's going to be a list, but it's going to use the rocket type instead of the launch type, and then the endpoint is just going to be rockets. Oops. Okay, so that handles that, and then to get a single rocket, we want to use a rocket type. We don't need it to be a list because it's only a single rocket. And for the arg, we're going to use the ID, which is going to be an int. And then down here, we just want to change this launches to rockets, and then args.id, because that's what it's going to use. All right, so I'm going to save that, and this will allow us to query a list of rockets and also a single rocket. We're not going to actually do that in our front-end React Apollo app, but I do just want it available just in case. And if you guys want to add to the front-end app, you can do that. But yeah, so I think we're pretty much done with our GraphQL server. So again, we're not doing any mutations, and mutations are fairly easy. They're not much different than making queries. So again, if you want to check that other 5-part series out, I'll put the link in the description. So in the next video, we're going to start on React. Okay, we're going to start on our client, which is going to take more time than it did to set up our server. I could have just started off with just saying, all right, clone this server and then we'll get started. But I wanted you guys to at least see how we can create a simple GraphQL server and connect it to a third-party API and so on. All right, so I will see you in the next video.